Really strong.
Okay, it's working. Good. It is nice to see everyone. I hope you all had a great Purim. But now we press on with the unfolding of the story of the Exodus. You may remember our last couple of weeks have been consumed with the discussion of the Mishkan, of the building of the tabernacle, or at least the design of the tabernacle. And now we are jumping in to, a rather unfortunate little episode. We're not going to focus on it, but I want to make sure you know it's there because it helps explain the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the parashah. In Tisa, this week's parashah, the most famous part of the parashah is the story of the golden calf. This is a very, very shameful and embarrassing part of our history, and one that has lingered with us for a very, very long time in terms of our self-identity and our psychology and everything else that goes on. And we talked a little bit about how the golden calf would even later be replicated in the northern kingdom of Israel after the split, after Solomon's death, by the building of the calves in the north. So this is not a one and done kind of thing. This is something that is going to linger. But one of the effects, one of the incidents that happens in the aftermath is an explanation of what does it mean to actually encounter God. Because remember, the golden calf was built not as a replacement for God, but as a replacement for Moses. It's often misunderstood. People will sometimes think that they were worshiping the golden calf as though it was some other God. That wasn't what the people were doing. The people were worried that Moses had disappeared, and they wanted something to lead them. And in their naivete, in the corruption that they had been infected with by the Egyptian people, they believed that what you need to lead, in quote, is an idol. And so they made the idol and they called it God. But they called it actually Adonai. They said, this is the God who led us out of Egypt. It was a bizarre psychological twist. But it was really about, we want to be in connection to God. We know we can't do that well on our own. We already had that whole incident back in Yitro with the whole Ten Commandment giving, and no, you go, we can't, blah, 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 like we talked about this year. So they wanted something that could give them that bridge, that could give them that connection. And as we also have talked about, that's one reason, perhaps, why the Mishkan was instructed to be built. And in fact, there are many commentators who say that the instructions were given for the tabernacle after the golden calf incident, even though it comes earlier in the order of chapters, that if you smooth out the chronology, it would have taken place after the golden calf. But like I said, that's some commentators, some others read it in the order in which it was given. So, encountering God, how do you do it? Well, let's find out how Tisa describes the encounter with God, and then we'll look at our commentary. So we are going to pick up in chapter 33, and we're on page 537 if you're in the Eitz Chaim. And we're going to pick up at verse 7. So we're in chapter 33, verse 7. If you're in the Eitz Chaim, that's in the bottom left-hand side. Everyone find where we are? Down there at the bottom left. Now Moses. Page 537. We're good. I still see pages flipping. I think we're okay. All right. Would you mind?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Now Moses would take the tent and pitch it outside the camp at some distance from the camp. It was called the tent of meeting. Whoever sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting that was outside the camp. Whenever Moses went out to the tent, all the people would rise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he had entered the tent. And when Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, while Hashem spoke with Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud poised at the entrance of the tent, all the people would rise and bow low, each at the entrance of his tent. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one man speaks to another. And he would then return to the camp, but his attendant, Joshua, son of Nun, a youth, would not stir out of the tent.
Okay, so what do we got? What we have is essentially a recreation of what has been happening at Sinai, which is Moses encountering God amidst and cloud. And this is giving him this direct experience, and the rest of the people are experiencing his experience vicariously, if they will, right? It's like going to watch a football game, right? You're not on the field, but you're watching the people who are on the field. And so you have a connection to the action by being a spectator of the action. So there's this one level of removed, except for Moses, of course. And what happens with Moses? How does Moses interact with God? What's
Face to face.
Face to face,
Face to
right?
face.
Face to face. Face to face. God has a face.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, but it doesn't seem like any other place God has a face, because God has no body. So, what is there? Cheekbones? How many teeth does God have?
Presence.
Well, we're going to have to work on this. But you had a question or comment?
I had a question. Numbers. I think it's in Numbers.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole outline that the Mishkan was in the center and everyone was camped around it. And here it says that it was outside the camp.
So, yes.
So they must have.
Right. No, I got
You
that
see
too.
that?
Yes.
I visioned that too, and I picture that. This is,
Yes.
we're not quite.
So, yes, we can maybe work on that commentary another time, because you're right. There is a debate over exactly how to reconcile this location of the Ohel Moed, the meeting tent, and the Mishkan. Now, there are some who argue that the Ohel Moed was a separate structure, and that this was placed outside of the camp in order that it be isolated from whatever spiritual problems the people in the camp might be having, and that Moses would go out there to have his communique from God.
Okay, that's what this is saying.
Well, that is one way to read this, right? Another way to read this, but there's a problem with that, of course, is that in the Mishkan, which was, according to Numbers, very clearly placed in the center of the camp, that was not only where the sacrifices were offered, but that was also where the Holy of Holies was, the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
So, and which we saw very recently was precisely the location where it said that God would emanate from in order to communicate to the people.
Right.
Now, we're going to get even more confused in Vayikra in just a couple of weeks when we talk about the idea that Moses would hear the sound of God coming from the Holy of Holies wherever he was when he was communicating with God. So it's almost like that became the loudspeaker to Moses. Does that mean he went to it, or does that just mean that he focused to it? That's what the commentators argue about. So whether or not he would have these experiences outside the camp and then move the tent back and forth, or whether or not it meant that it was inside the camp, but he would have his communication outside the camp while looking towards the tent, this is what commentators debate, right? It is hard to reconcile the two different tents here. But, hard to reconcile means more to learn.
That's right.
But not today, because today we have a different thing to wrestle with.
Okay.
Because Moses does not seem exactly content, right? Moses is about to push his luck. He's got face to face with God, but he wants more. Onward.
Moses said to the Lord, "See, you say to me, lead this people forward, but you have not made known to me whom you will send with me. Further, you have said, I have singled you out by name, and you have indeed gained my favor. Now, if I have truly gained your favor, pray let me know your ways, that I may know you and continue in your favor. Consider, too, that this nation is your people."
All right. So what's Moses's chutzpah here? What's his name? Oh, that's fine. What's he want?
He wants to know God
More.
more.
He wants to know God more.
More.
Right? He's
He
saying,
wants
look,
to know what the plans are.
this is great, God. You're going to continue to communicate with me, and we're doing this all face to face, as the verse prior said. But I want to understand you more deeply than I currently do, right? Which is going to bring a bit of a question of what does face to face mean. But it seems like what Moses wants is a further intensification, a further deepening of that relationship, of that connection. And he's saying, look, if I'm going to be leading the people, I need to know you so that I can do it right. Because it's not just enough, as we've talked about before, to have a book. to have, an instruction, you have to understand what the instructions mean, right? When someone, who you know very well says, when you ask them, how are you doing? And they say, fine. If you know them really well, sometimes you'll be able to know when they said fine, what they really meant was, I'm not fine, please ask me more, right? The better you know a person, the more you know exactly what they mean by the words they say. For Moses to lead the people, he needs to know exactly what God means by all the words God tells him, and he needs to do that by understanding God even better than he currently does. At least that's Moses's ask. That's what he is requesting here. We got the shape of his request? Okay, God's response.
And the Lord said, I will go in the lead, and I will lighten your burden. And Moses said to the Lord, unless you go in the lead, do not make us leave this place. For how shall it be known that your people have gained your favor unless you go with us, so that we may be distinguished, your people and I, from every people on the face of the earth?
Right? Yes, you're going to go with us, but I need you to go with us. Right? This needs to be revealed, not merely you're around. Right? This is not just we're going to say, oh, God is with us, Adonai. It needs to be a tangible, palpable presence that everyone will understand it. And the only way that will work is if I can understand you better than anyone else has ever understood you in all of history. Because then I can make you manifest through the community. Because remember, the Torah is about making God's will manifest physically through our actions. But that only works if we know God's will. Because if we get God's will wrong, then what we're doing isn't necessarily what God asked for. Following so far the logic here? Right? To understand God is necessary in order to lead the people and make them representative of God on earth, and to make them then known as being led by God, not just by some charlatan or even just some guy who half knows what God wants.
Well, the other thing is, if Moses is leading this huge crowd of people through these areas, they may think that these people are coming to make war on them.
Oh, we get that later, yes.
That would be very scary. So you have to, so I can see what it says. So we've been distinguished. The other people would also know that we're coming for good.
Right. This needs to be clear.
Yeah.
And for that to be clear, you and I, God, we need to be clear. Okay, onward.
And the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing that you have asked, for you have truly gained my favor, and I have singled you out by name.
Woohoo!
Moses said, oh, let me behold your presence. And the Lord answered, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you the name, Lord, and the grace that I grant and the compassion that I show. But, the Lord said, you cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live.
What? Wait, hold on. Didn't we just...
Didn't we just see him face to
Yeah,
face?
verse 11, face to face. Verse 20, no one can see my face.
Right.
Okay.
Keep reading.
And the Lord said, see, there's a place near me. Station yourself on the rock. And as my presence passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I'll shield you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen.
Okay, well, that's clear.
Yeah, but did you ever watch the show Dating in the Dark? People talk face to
Dating
face,
in the dark.
but they don't see each other.
Okay,
So
so
there is this, it is possible. You can talk face to face without seeing somebody.
if I'm wearing a Purim mask, are you really talking to my face? But I'm in the room, we're talking, right?
But you're right there.
Right, but that,
Well, you're talking to the person, even though you can't see their face.
exactly right. So maybe there is another level beyond what Moses has already experienced that God is saying is not available. The difficulty here, of course, is that we use the same phrase, face to face, for both of them.
Right.
Is that a bad interpretation?
No, that's a literal
That's a
translation.
literal
Yeah,
translation.
because
Face to face.
trying to translate this idiomatically is what gets you into commentary. Because what does it mean to talk to someone or God face to face? And what does it mean to say, I'll put my hand over you and you'll see my back?
Yeah.
What does that mean, right? Idiomatically. And the fact is that the translation here is perfectly fine because it's hard to capture whatever the poetry is trying to tell us here, which is why we're going to see some commentary that does this for us. Now, we're not going to get into the next few sections because we have to get time for our commentary study, but what exactly does God proclaim as he passes in front of Moses in the cleft of the rock?
The Lord.
Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, right? Very famous passage that's quoted many, many times in our current liturgy services, comes exactly from here. This is the expression of God's essence, if you will. And it dwells mostly on God's compassion and slowness to anger and willingness to forgive. It does also mention, although we in the quote in our own services, that God doesn't forgive everything if you're still being a jerk. We sort of don't mention that part because usually when we're doing the 13 attributes, we are focusing on reminding ourselves that God is willing to forgive us when we are willing to do that work, and pointing out that the other side of it would not be conducive to encouraging that tshuva, that repentance. So what does it mean, though, to see face to face? What does it mean to see God's back? What does it mean to see God at all? So let's get these passed around. So we got the two quotes at the top when it comes around that are from 33:20, the "you cannot see my face," and then 33:11, that they would speak face to face.
You know, it must have been strange for people when they could use the telephone. You think about it, to communicate, and you were face to face, but
But not.
Time between you.
Right. Well,
there was suddenly this.
but I will tell you that the phone is not face to face.
No,
Because one of the challenges I would often pose to my English students when I was in Japan was to turn your chairs back to back and do the conversation as though you were over the phone. And even students who had a quite strong grasp of English found their language comprehension and communication skills plummeted. Because we are so used to getting those feedback of other people's eyes, the facial muscle, all the things that tell us they understand, they don't understand, they're happy, they're sad. We are so used to those, especially that when we try to grapple with it in a foreign language, it's just crash and burn. It's so hard, even if you have just the voice, to make more sense of it without the face. So yes, but there are other things in technology. Very famously, when the first motion picture of a train was shown in France, people fled the theater,
right.
thinking that the train was about to come through the wall of the theater. Which, if you've seen the old film reels, it's like, come on, guys, you thought that was real. But if you had no frame of reference of what these things were like, yeah, I can see how people initially might have been a little startled. But
you have 3D pictures. Man, I was stuck even they were doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, thankfully 3D TV seems to have fizzled out. Eventually we'll just plug it into the back of our brain like the Matrix, but not yet. Although the virtual reality goggles are becoming more and more popular and mainstream. I don't think those are going to go away anytime soon, but I don't think they're also going to be sitting around just using them 100% either. We'll see. Anyway, technology aside, let's go back to Sforno, who has a little comment about what does it mean when it says that God would speak to Moses face to face.
So one line we read in Exodus said, "You cannot see my face, for man may not see me and live." But a little bit earlier it said, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one man speaks to another.
And what does that mean, says Sforno?
In full possession of his senses.
All right, so this is going back to an understanding from the Talmud and many other rabbinic texts, Rambam most famously, but many authorities, that says, except for Moses, everyone else who experienced God did so through a vision or a dream state or something else that put them in an altered state of perception. They were, to use the modern vernacular, tripping. They were not in full possession of their senses. They were transported mentally into a whole different way of reality, and that allowed them to then have these experiences. Moses, on the other hand, when he experienced God like you would when you're talking to another person, right? He experienced God while still being able to see the sun, the moon, the stars, the grass, the sheep, the people, the smell of the animal, all of the stuff that was normally around him. He was still aware of, even as he was also aware of God. He was not transported from himself. It was not a transcendental experience. It was an experience as though he were still completely rooted in this world. And that makes Moses unique. Now, how do we have proof for this difference of how he perceived versus others? Well, let's look at 3 different cases of people perceiving God in different parts of the Tanakh, of the Bible. So the first comes from Exodus, actually a little bit earlier on.
Then Moses and Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended, and they saw the God of Israel. Under God's feet, there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky for purity. Yet the Lord did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They beheld God, and they ate and drank.
Okay, so they had a little picnic at God's feet. Sounds like what they're saying, right?
Up on the mountain.
But we also know that Moses, when he tells the people reminds them of Mount Sinai, he says, you beheld no image. So what's this? This was the image they imagined, right? This is the image that was in the mind of the elders and the others, right? When they sat at the foot of Mount Sinai, when they were rejoicing over this brit, the covenant with God, this is what they had in their own transportation of their mind, their transcendental experience. This is what came to mind. The sages teach us that when a prophet or anyone has an experience like this, it is shaped and it fills the container of their own experiences. So if you were imagining the most awe-inspiring, powerful thing you could possibly imagine, and you happen to be living 3,000 years ago, well, you'd probably think throne. You'd probably think king. You'd probably think gemstones and shiny things and all the stuff that is the trappings of power from my world. Does that mean God actually has a chair and gemstones and all of that? No. But it does mean that that is the only metaphor that would work in the ancient mind for what it means to be this awesomely magnificent, because they were relating it to what they could, and that they had a limited frame of reference, again, like we talked about before. But Moses, on the other hand, Moses could see God, in quote, without that. Right? Moses, we never sees God. We are never told that Moses sees God with a chair. Moses never sees God with sapphires. Moses never sees God with anything. Moses just understands God. And the more he understands God, the less imagination is needed for God to take shape in his mind. It's counterintuitive because we tend to gravitate towards the flashy descriptions, and very little gets flashier than Ezekiel 1.
Above the expanse over their heads was the semblance of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And on top, upon this semblance of a throne, there was the semblance of a human form. What appeared as his loins up, I saw a gleam of amber, what looked like a fire encased in a frame. And from what appeared at his loins down, I saw what looked like fire. There was a radiance all about him, like the appearance of the bow, which shines in the clouds on a day of rain.
Like what we call a rainbow.
Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. That was the appearance of the semblance of the presence of the Lord. When I beheld it, I flung myself down on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. Okay, so imagine you live 2,000 plus years ago, like Ezekiel here, and you have never seen a Technicolor movie, ever. Right? They just don't exist. You've never seen even Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel level of painting, that level of vibrancy of pigments. You rarely see people in anything like a fancy colored clothing because it's hard to make and expensive. You know, that's enough of a distinction that we have the whole thing about Joseph's coat as getting our attention as a detail. So what do you know of your world that is vibrant and amazing? A rainbow. I mean, most of us take rainbows for granted, but even still, I mean, even now, even though we are exposed to so many different forms of colors and vibrancy and everything else in life, most people, if they see a rainbow in the sky, are still going to stop and look, right? It's still kind of impressive to us. Imagine what it was if it was the most impressive display of color that you ever saw in your life. Would you not then associate that with God when you have an experience of connecting to God?
right? What does it mean to be vibrant? Well, the only thing I can possibly have in my mind that comes close to the experience I'm having now is the shining colors of a rainbow. Right? What does it mean to be magnificent? Fire, flame. These are things that my mind associates with power and glory and all the things that are amazing in life that I only get little bits of or have to keep under control, like fire. So Ezekiel, this is how he sees God, because he has to see God through this metaphor, through this imagination. And then after having got that full connection, he falls on his face, and that's when he's actually hearing God, right? It's like a connection's been established through this metaphor, and then the real actual content begins, right? The whole imagery is the ringing of the telephone. Does that make sense? And then you pick up,
Right.
and then you get the actual information. Right? God was not revealing himself in this form because he wanted Ezekiel to make sure everyone knew what was loins up and what was loins down. Right? That was just him getting Ezekiel's attention, and the only way he could get his attention was for Ezekiel to put this in a framework that he could understand. One more example of someone having an experience that is a bit transcendental.
In the year that King Uzziah died, I beheld my Lord seated on a high and lofty throne, and the skirts of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs stood in attendance on him. Each of them had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his legs, and with 2 he would fly. And one would call to the other, Holy, 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 the Lord of hosts. His presence fills all the earth.
Kadosh, kadosh,
Yes,
kadosh,
kadosh.
right? Okay, good. We all recognize that passage. Wait a minute. So Isaiah also has a vision of God, in this kingly sort of metaphor. But where's the rainbow? Where's the amber? Where's the fire? Right? This seems a little more low key than Ezekiel. Well, how do we explain Isaiah's more, mundane experience of God compared to Ezekiel's? Well, the Talmud says the following.
Rabbah said, whatever Ezekiel saw, Isaiah saw.
Like, wait a minute. No, that's not what it said. Right? It said that Ezekiel saw rainbows and fire and ember and all this other stuff. And it didn't say that about Isaiah. How can you tell me that Isaiah saw the same stuff of Ezekiel if Isaiah's description is much more prosaic than Ezekiel's description?
Well, what is Ezekiel like? He's like a rural man who saw the king. What is Isaiah like? He's like an urban man who saw the king.
Right? It's just always stunning to me that people had the same idea about what does it mean to have a frame of reference. Right? You imagine the country farmer comes to town and the king's procession goes by. And for the country farmer, that is the most amazing thing he has ever seen in his life. He has nothing to compare it to. And he's bedazzled by every possible detail, every bit of glitz, every bit of, just shine that's on it, right? The bling is overwhelming. But if you live in the town, maybe you don't see the king every day, but you might have seen the king once, or perhaps you've seen other noble people. You've definitely seen glitz. It's not king level glitz, but it's glitz. And so then when you do see the king, yes, the king's impressive, but it's not as different of a situation for you. And that means that Isaiah is considered to be the greater prophet. Right? Isaiah is the one who saw God more because he saw God with less. Right? The fewer and fewer details the prophet gives you about what God looks like, it means the greater and greater ability the prophet had to understand God without the structure of their imagination providing the framework.
But Isaiah sees this image in the temple itself. I mean, he's peering through.
Well, temple plus, but yes.
Yeah, he's peering into the ark, into the place where he's not supposed to be looking, supposedly.
Well, but again, this is a vision. This doesn't actually mean that he is physically there, because as we saw from the earlier Sforno comment, only Moses was there when he did things. Right? Isaiah could have been asleep in his bed when he had that image.
Okay.
It does radically change how we perceive what the prophets were perceiving. right? Which is why the rabbis were very clear. Now, they're going to try and drive this point home. This is taken from Vayikra Rabbah, but it's found in other places as well, about the difference between Moses and the other prophets, because sometimes we don't give Moses enough credit, partly because Moses doesn't get as flashy with his poetry when he talks about his relationship with God. Right? And this, again, can also be compared, before we get into the description, it'd be like, imagine somebody who was, the personal trainer of a movie star. And then imagine someone who just goes to the movies all the time and, loves the movies and watches Entertainment Tonight all the time. And then they go to Hollywood and they see the movie star walking down the sidewalk. They're going to have two very different experiences, right? The guy who's the personal trainer, they've seen the movie star, sweaty and weak and exhausted and looking like a normal human being. The guy who only sees the movie star as being this, is going to, even when they see them on the sidewalk, only see the glitz and the glamour, even if the person's wearing sweatpants. Right? Moses sees the reality without all of the extra halo. The halo is a wasted addition that is only our mind's attempt to try and come to grips with what we're seeing. If you had Moses's mind, you wouldn't need the halo. You wouldn't need to see it. But let's let the Midrash tell it better than me.
What difference is there between Moses and all other prophets? Rabbi Judah and the rabbis give different explanations. Rabbi Judah said, through 9 lenses did the prophets behold visions. This is indicated by what is said, and the appearance of the vision which I saw was like the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city, and the visions were like the vision that I saw by the river Chebar, and I fell upon my face.
I'll also take it from Ezekiel. So what do we get there? A whole lot of usage of the word vision. Right? A vision, a vision, a vision, a vision. Now, modern day multiple lens optics, we tend to think of that as being good. But I'll tell you a rule of thumb that I learned when I began learning photography, which is the more pieces of glass you put between the film and the subject, the worse the image. As a general rule. I mean, there's a difference between different bits of glass and all of that, but every time you put a piece of glass between you and the film, you are losing something, right? The light does not go through every piece of glass perfectly. You might say this in a modern term, because most of us don't think of lenses like that, because we're blessed to have good lenses. Thank you for my glasses. What is a photocopy compared to a photocopy of 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 a photocopy?
Yeah.
You're losing information, and what else happens when you do that?
It's not clear.
It's not clear.
Because what not just they're not focused, but that's part of it. I mean, those of you who have ever tried to make a photocopy of a photocopy, what happens to the overall image? It gets darker, and there are blotches that begin to appear on it, right? Those are the, if you'll pardon the expression, I don't mean to denigrate the great prophets, those are the contaminations of the human mind as it tries to struggle to understand God, right? When they see God, their mind is clouded because they are trying to filter this information through the apparatus they have, which is far superior to anything that any one of us has. But compared to Moses, is only like a ninth of what he had. So as great as they are, Moses still completely trounces them. But notice what the Midrash is still keeping in place. Even Moses sees through a lens. Right? Moses is still seeing through a lens. It's not that he is getting a perfect 100% eye-to-eye kind of relationship. Onward.
But Moses beheld visions through one lens, as it is said, with him do I speak in a vision and not in dark speeches.
Right? It's just a different level of clarity.
Then the rabbi said, all the other prophets beheld through a blurred lens, and it has said, and I have multiplied visions, and by the ministry of the prophets have I used similitudes. But Moses beheld through a polished lens, and it said, the similitude of the Lord does he behold.
Right? It's not visions plus images, it is the clear image itself. It's still an image rather than the reality, which is God has no physical form, but it is as close as a human being is able to get. Does that make sense? Okay. By the way, this is the underlying reason why the Torah is authoritative in the sense that it gives commands. This is the source of our mitzvot. And why the rest of the Tanakh, barring a few exhortations and clarifications, does not. Right? When we read through the book of Joshua, we don't find mitzvot. We find the fulfillment of mitzvot. We find them actually doing mitzvahs, but we don't find a new thou shalt or thou shalt not in the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Kings. They don't command. Those were written by prophets. Those were written by people who had a relationship with God, but it was not so clear that they could give a prophecy like Moses that would be 100% authoritative for all time. And so too for the prophets who preceded Moses. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who knew what God wanted from them, did not have a clear enough vision of God that they could take their experience and say, this is a law for all time. Make sense? Right? Even, for example, the one very famous example of Brit Milah, of circumcision, if Moses had not come along and ratified the idea that circumcision was going to be a mitzvah for all time, then it would not have been a mitzvah for all time. It would have been a mitzvah throughout Abraham's, family for a while. But it needed Moses to restate it throughout the Torah that this was a permanent mitzvah. Because as great as Abraham was, he was no Moses. Again, not to detract from him. None of us are fit to be in his shadow, but still, it's important to understand how much further ahead Moses was than the rest. All right. Which is going to lead us now to the 8 chapters, the Shemona Prakim. This is a very famous short work by Rambam. Highly recommend. You can find copies of this online. It's a short read. It's a very good summary of how to understand sort of many of the basic aspects of Judaism and Jewish thought. But he gets back into this idea of face-to-face.
When Moses, our teacher, discovered that there remained no partition between himself and God which he had not removed, and when he attained perfection by acquiring every possible moral and mental virtue, he sought to comprehend God in his true reality, since there seemed no longer to be any hindrance to it.
Right? So he was speaking face to face, our verse 11. He's got it. And he's like, wow, this is amazing. This is working. I have achieved a level of human perfection that has not been reached before. Now I want what comes next. Right? Now I want to understand your ways. Now I want what's next.
He therefore implored of God in Exodus, show me, I beseech thee, thy glory. But God informed him that this was impossible, as his intellect, since he was a human being, was still influenced by matter. So God's answer was, in Exodus, for no man can see me and live. Thus, there remained between Moses and his comprehension of the true essence of God only one transparent obstruction, and that was his human intellect still resident in matter.
Right? As great as the human mind is, and as powerful as the human soul is, as long as it is still a resident of matter, as long as it is still limited by being part of the physical world, there will always be some percentage that it cannot comprehend of God.
Because God is not limited by matter. So
Exactly. It's the the old joke of a creature that lived on a 2-dimensional plane like a sheet of paper would not understand what the third dimension even meant. And we don't even know what we don't know about how much different God's existence is than our existence, only that it is fundamentally different because it ain't like our existence. And so therefore, our being trapped in this world will always leave at least a little barrier. For most of us, that barrier is a lot bigger than it was for Moses, but there will always be, no matter what, some limitation. And that's how Rambam reconciles. I speak face to face, meaning as much as I could because you are a man, because you are human, but you can't get more than that because to get all of it, you can't be alive. Onward. This is actually a guide from the Perplexed. Pardon my abbreviation on the citation. I did that in order to make it all fit on the page. GFP, Guide for Perplexed, Moré Nevelchim.
This is perplexing.
Yes. Oh, by the way, so this is the early section of Guide for Perplexed. I always thought that Rambam wrote his book in this particular order to weed out those who were not really interested, because the whole first, almost a majority of the first portion of Guide for the Perplexed is terminology. It's defining terms. What does this word mean? What does that word mean? What does this word mean when it relates to people? What does that word mean when it relates to God? It is incredibly really dry, right? We could stop, the rising sea levels by just putting copies in front of it. But it is also incredibly rich and insightful. But you have to be willing to do the work to get through it and really appreciate the insights that are being generated by his very careful analysis of the term. Here, the term that he is working on is the term achor. By the way, the H with the dot underneath it is the classic academic signal for the sound.
Ready?
Yep.
The term achor is a homonym. I guess that means it has not a lot of different meanings.
Exactly right. It's got the same sound, but in different places, it's going to mean different things. Like horn and horn.
Yeah.
Right? Horn and horn. Right? Or Horn of Africa. There's many different meanings of the word horn, even though the word is exactly the same. Same too with the word achor.
It is a noun signifying back,
This.
like behind achare, the tabernacle. That means back of the tabernacle.
Exactly.
The spear came out behind him, acharav.
Right? And out the back.
It is next used in reference to time, signifying after. Neither after him, acharav, or was there any like him.
Right? So acharav can mean like out on his back, but acharav can also mean after him sequentially, right? Behind him in time would be a way to try and shoehorn it into English.
There's also after acharav, these things.
Mm-hmm.
In this sense, the word occurs frequently. The term includes also the idea of following a thing and of conforming with the moral principles of some other being.
All right, so notice we just made a huge shift from being physically on the back,
Right,
temporarily behind something, which is still really a kind of physical manifestation, space and time being linked. And now we're moving to more of a principle, of a personality issue, which is what's going to be explained.
Ye shall walk after achare, the Lord your God. They shall walk after achare, the Lord. That is, follow his will, walk in the ways of his actions, and imitate his virtues. As in, he walked after achare, the commandment.
Right? So that is not talking physically, right? It's not as though the commandments are in front of us and we are walking behind them, but you can still see the metaphor of walking after, meaning to follow along behind something that is leading a path. And you can see how this, might develop from early hiking, or, the way sheep follow each other, and in order to know the right way to go, they would follow the shepherd. There's metaphors that might be implied here, but it's a personality thing rather than necessarily physical.
So you could follow somebody physically, or just follow what I say.
Exactly. The same way that we follow instructions, as we say in English.
In this sense, the word occurs in Exodus, and thou shalt see my back, achare. That means thou shalt perceive that which follows me is similar to me and is the result of my will. That is, all things created by me, as will be explained in the course of this treatise.
Which was, the whole rest of the book. But what he's trying to say here is that when it said that God walked in front of the crevice, put his hand, Moses could see God's back, don't think you were looking at God's back. Right? That doesn't mean that he was able to see God's broad shoulders, or God's ponytail, because of course God has a ponytail. It means that to see what had come because of God, what the world was due to God's ways, and that he would understand from that God. He could see the connection between the effect God had on the world, or was having on the world, will be having on the world. Tenses are weird when you talk about God. And God's self. Whereas most of us, we're not able to see that, right? We don't see God moving in the world. Again, to use very cumbersome language, we kind of, sort of, maybe perceive, hope, but Moses could actually see. The same way that a person who is well trained can read the tracks of a deer and know how big the deer was, how old the deer was, whether it was limping, and all those other kinds of things they put into movies. Or somebody could actually see the wake of a boat, and they would know which way the boat went, how long it went, and all. Moses can read God's footprints. That's what it means to see the back of God. Does that make sense? Okay, onward.
Our rabbis have taught 4 entered into the Pardes. There were Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Aher, that's Elisha ben Abuya, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai gazed and died. Of him it is written, precious in the eyes of God is the death of his pious ones. And that's from Psalms.
Wait, what's going on here?
Yeah.
All right, so what is pardes? Pardes is a metaphor used in rabbinic literature to mean to enter into a sublime transcendental state of encountering God. Right, so they basically are having a mystical experience of God. 4 of them do it, right? And Ben Azai, he looks and he dies. Okay, what about number 2, Ben Zoma?
Ben Zoma gazed and went insane. Of him it is written, have you found honey? Eat your lest you become full and vomit it up.
Right, so apparently it was overwhelming to him and he blew the circuits in his mind.
Acher became an apostate.
That was Elisha ben Abuya, right? He basically rejects Judaism. He rejects God after this mystical experience.
Rabbi Akiva entered and exited in peace.
All right, so 25% success rate,
Yeah.
right? The other 75% were lost, right? This is the trouble with mysticism. As I tried to explain in my own notes there at the bottom, right? If I can grasp God, if I can have that immediate experience, that mano a mano, that hand in hand, face to face, why do I want to still be here? Why do I want to come back to this world? Right? If I can transcend this world, what would bring me back? And that's a temptation for many people who try to have a mystical experience, because they take the step into the next and they forget why they should ever come back. And that was the first, right? That was Ben Azai. Ben Zoma, on the other hand, right? If I can see God but not grasp, then my mind will break. If you're not prepared for this, then, and you're still stuck in a human brain, matter and all of that, then you're gonna fry. Your own mental capacity will short out. And if I can grasp God directly, why do I need Torah? And this has actually been one of the most difficult and dangerous parts of mysticism in Judaism for many, many hundreds of years, exemplified by the Sabbatean movement, but by others as well, that basically was saying, look, if Torah is my way of getting to God, if I can get to God without it, why would I bother keeping it? Right? Why do all of the hard work of Torah and living a Torah life? And I don't just mean keeping kosher, but I mean not murdering, not stealing, not committing adultery. Why would I do all that stuff if I can get to God without it? It's a good question, right? You feel like a sucker if you're going through all the hard way and someone else is cutting the line. And that is a big problem with people who pursue mystical experiences, especially when they come back and say, oh, wait, I've had the mystical experience and now I can tell the rest of you what you don't need to do.
They miss out on a life of good deeds.
Oh, but they miss out on plenty. But the problem is the human mind is very, right, but the human mind is very capable of saying, I'm not missing out on anything. I still can perceive God. I still had this experience. What else do I want? And it's very easy to become self-delusional. That's the real danger. So what are we left with then? We don't get to experience God, right? If we got a 25% chance of success, if you're lucky to be one of the greatest who ever lived, then the rest of us schnooks who aren't prophets and definitely aren't Moses and aren't even in the category of these other 4, amazing people, then I guess we're never going to experience God, right? We're just left sitting outside the tent, watching the clouds settle and just bowing to the ground, knowing that someone else out there is having an experience that we'll never be able to share.
Is there a midrash that says that Moses asked God before he died to look ahead, and he saw Rabbi Akiva?
Yes, very famously. Yes.
It's-
Yep, and he saw Rabbi Akiva and he thought that Rabbi Akiva was amazing. I'm just shortening the story.
Right.
And then he said, well, if he's so amazing, what's his reward? And then he sees Rabbi Akiva being pulled apart by the iron combs. And he's like, why? At which point, well, on both points, when he asks, well, why did you give me the Torah when Rabbi Akiva could have gotten it? And God says, be quiet. And then he says, well, why is Rabbi Akiva being killed this way? And God says, be quiet.
Right.
Basically reminding us very much that even Moses does not fully understand God, does not fully understand God's ways. That is the whole idea for most of the commentaries, that what Moses ultimately couldn't quite be able to put together was bad stuff and good people and good stuff and bad people. He could see God's back and he could see the pattern in the world that worked generally, but there were so many examples where it was not the way we think it should be. And that was what Moses still failed to properly grasp. But to come back to the rest of us who don't even grasp the beginnings of what Moses did, what do we have to look forward to?
In this world, the Shekhinah manifests itself only to chosen individuals. In the time to come, however, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it.
All right, so we can hope, right? Hope for the days of Mashiach and the days of Messiah, that we will finally have at least a cloudy view of God, because with the Mashiach coming, the illusions and the distractions of this world that continue to pollute our minds and our behavior will be removed, and we'll have a better view. But, not all of us are going to get to the days of Mashiach in our lifetime. I mean, we all hope and pray that it would, but at least if we're talking about, the odds, none of us count on it. However, the Zohar has one last insight that I thought was very, very beautiful.
Another explanation of, and God appeared to him by the terebinths of God.
That was when God appeared to Abraham just after the circumcision, when the three people come and the whole birth of Isaac story begins.
The sages began with this verse that speaks of the time of one's demise.
Right, that is a metaphor for dying. Keep going.
We learned that Rabbi Yehuda said that at the time of a person's death, which is the day of the great judgment when the soul is separated from the body, no one leaves the world before he sees the Shekhinah, because it's written, "For no man shall see me and live."
Right, therefore,
If you're not living, you must have seen me.
how do you die? Ultimately, the last thing that kills you is experiencing God fully. Right? When it is your time to go, you do get to experience God fully. All of us. Because the verse says, no one sees God and lives. And that's the method by which you go. Now, what happens after that depends on what you've been living. But everyone gets that experience. That everyone will have the ability to understand and connect to God, even in this world, even for the very last moment of their life in this world. Right? God does not stay distant from everyone. Yes, this world sometimes makes it feel like that. But it is our duty and our pleasure to try and get as close to God as we can in this life, without the dangers of pardes, without the dangers of shorting ourselves out, but also without the dangers of despair that we can never know God, and so it's pointless to even try. No, we try as much as we can. We continue to reflect, to study and learn, and we get as close as we can, and ultimately, all of us get to behold God eventually. Good? Good. It's a happy note, trust me. I know talking about death sometimes depresses people, but if I have to go, this is not a bad way to go.